Speed and movement is something a lot of games try to focus on. Hell, there's a whole genre dedicated to it. However, up until recently, we've seen very few games attempting to do this from a first-person perspective. For the longest time, the only thing we really had was Mirror's Edge. However, over the past few years, we've started to get more and more with the likes of the Mirror's Edge sequel, Titanfall 2, and Doom Eternal. And now, adding onto that list, we have Ghostrunner. Ghostrunner is a first-person cyberpunk action platformer that places a large focus on its amazing central gameplay loop of killing a room of enemies while moving at incredible speed. However, the game's not perfect and has many shortcomings that hold it back from being great. But first, a spoiler warning. I will be discussing almost everything in Ghostrunner, so if that's something you're concerned about, you should probably turn back now. Personally, I don't think there's anything in this video that will ruin the experience for you. It's not worth playing for the little bit of story I'll spoil, and it's very much a game that you'll get more out of from playing than watching. But if you're insistent, then go play the game before watching this video. Alright then, all good? Then let's get started. The most obvious thing that sticks out whenever viewing gameplay or trailers for Ghostrunner, aside from its cyberpunk aesthetic, will be the sheer speed of its combat system. At first glance, it appears to take the movement of Titanfall 2 and add on the slowdown mechanic of Superhot, which is actually quite accurate. The game managed to pull off this combination very well, however not without stumbling a little bit. On top of your usual movement of running, jumping, and vaulting, you'll also have a wall run, a slide, a dash, which will cancel out all your momentum and dash forward in the direction that you're facing, a grappling hook, which you can use on predetermined points, and finally, the ability to slow down time for a brief moment. Stringing together different moves never got old, attempting to build as much speed as possible while killing all the enemies and avoiding their attacks. This is amplified further with some amazing music that really encourages you to build up more and more momentum, on top of everything in game that encourages this faster movement. There's also a timer for each level, encouraging you to replay a level even faster, though a leaderboard does feel strangely absent. The game, in almost every way, encourages you to move faster, kill quicker, and when you're doing this is when the game is at its best. So the inclusion of hitting collectibles feels oddly out of place. They're often placed hidden throughout the environment, encouraging the player to slow down and explore every nook and cranny. It doesn't help that the rewards are usually lackluster, being some small tidbit of lore, which, if I'm being honest, never was very interesting, although the sword skins were quite nice. I eventually decided to stop looking for them around halfway through my first playthrough, and found myself enjoying the game much more because of it. Anyways, getting back to the movement, as the game progressed and I played more of it, I started to notice some small issues with the movement system. The most minor of these was how the grappling hook targets the closest target rather than the one you're looking at. This wasn't that big a deal and was fine once I realized what was going on and adjusted accordingly, but it never really stopped feeling counterintuitive. A much larger issue, however, is with the wall running. Wall running in Ghostrunner is rather simple. You just run forward with a wall on either side and slightly move into it and you'll start wall running. This was mostly consistent, although I did have some issues on a few specific walls like this one here. The largest issue with wall running, however, is also one of its greatest strengths: the fact that you can wall run on literally anything. This can be great in some situations, such as being able to run along near the very top of a ledge and then jumping to get at an enemy at a weird angle. But more often than not, it leads to you wall running off some railing slightly above the ground or some other object instead of the wall you were trying to run on. For obvious reasons, this was quite frustrating, as coupled with the fact that you also die in one hit, whenever this happened, there was a pretty good chance that it would lead to death. This is alleviated somewhat by the fact that the game is rather generous with its checkpoints to offset the game's already difficult nature. However, it still occurred enough that I considered starting a tally to keep track of how many times it happened, and I kinda wish I would have so I could have emphasized this point further. Another issue with wall running also ties in with another movement mechanic, vaulting. Whenever you get close to a ledge and are in the air, whether that be falling or jumping, you'll pull yourself over it, serving the obvious purpose of helping you get a little further with a jump, and avoiding the annoyance of looking like you made a jump but not making it, because your foot was slightly too low. However, it suffers from the same issue that the wall running does, which is that you can vault over or onto anything. This would sometimes cause some issues while wall running near the top of some walls. Some walls are strung from the rooftop via a chain or stick out from the rest of the wall and are paper thin, so there's never a reason you would want to vault over these. But because you can vault over anything, you can. All it takes is being near the top and looking a little too much towards the wall, which you will at some points if you're rapidly jumping between multiple walls, and you'll go right over top. Despite all the time I've spent talking about these issues, most of them were infrequent enough that they didn't detract from my enjoyment of the movement that much. Overall, I still think that the movement system was incredibly enjoyable and incredibly fast, and is complemented nicely by the rest of the game's combat. Combat in Ghostrunner is quite simple. You simply avoid the enemy's attacks and slice at them or use one of your energy abilities. This simple description would imply a lack of complexity to its combat. However, that's not the case at all, since unlike other games where moving around the environment and avoiding enemy fire isn't that fleshed out, it's the key focus here. Almost all ranged enemies shoot projectiles, meaning they take time to hit you, allowing you to avoid most of them as long as you keep moving and aren't running directly towards them. This incentivizes you to keep moving and interact more with the game's movement. Unfortunately, your energy abilities don't seem to have been given as much thought as the rest of the combat. The game claims to have 4 energy abilities, however, it's more like 2, since the first 3 are just the same ability with a slightly different spin. Blink is a multi-target ranged attack that teleports you to the furthest enemy after activation. Tempest is a multi-target ranged attack that sends enemies and objects flying. Surge is a multi-target ranged attack that sends an energy sword at the targeted enemies, and Overlord, a single target ranged attack that causes the targeted enemy to attack other enemies. Now, you may have noticed that I just said multi-target ranged attack a bunch of times, and that's exactly my point! The first 3 are essentially just the same attack, but each with a slight twist, where Blink teleports you to the enemy, Tempest doesn't allow you to target specific enemies and sends out a wave, and Surge allows you to target multiple enemies from a distance. Honestly, Tempest and Surge are so similar, I don't even know why they're both here. They should have just cut out Surge entirely, since it has another issue on top of it already being redundant. When you use Surge, it will highlight the enemies you will hit with it, just like Blink. But if the enemies are just barely being targeted, the attack misses them. I had this happen constantly, and it pretty much made Surge unusable. With Surge being unusable and Tempest and Overlord being very situational, left the only consistent choice being Blink, which is honestly fine. But the fact that most of the energy abilities being useless is fine is a problem, as it demonstrates how they aren't integrated into the game's combat well. There is never any part in the game where an ability is necessary to progress, essentially regulating them to crutches to stand on instead. And this isn't inherently a bad thing. It's disappointing, as it could have led to more complex level layouts and enemy placement, but not bad. Giving a player a tool they can use if they're stuck is fine, similar to how you can summon up a player in Dark Souls. However, the game doesn't communicate this well to the player. In fact, the game does the exact opposite, and makes a big deal out of these whenever you get one and tells you how necessary they are for climbing the tower and defeating Mara.
You know what to do. It might be our best find yet.
Instead, you can find time-limited power-ups in some stages that are necessary, those being the Shuriken, Time Slow, and a single-use super jump. I can't fucking believe I couldn't think of anything better. There's no official name, okay? The game doesn't always use these power-ups perfectly, but most of the time, since the game knows the player will have these, they can adjust the levels accordingly, allowing for a greater degree of complexity. Because of this, I found these much more interesting than the energy abilities. Like I said earlier, however, at the end of the day, energy abilities don't have any major impact on gameplay and can be completely ignored if you want to. However, what can't be avoided are the enemies and bosses. Initially, upon completing the game, I thought that it hadn't had that much variety in enemies. However, upon reflection and looking at an enemy list, I realized that I was actually mistaken, and that there was actually twice the number of enemies I initially thought there was. I think the reason I had my initial reaction was due to two factors. Firstly, that the game introduces many of these enemies too late into the game to build on them in interesting ways, and secondly, that the game never throws more than maybe 3 or 4 enemy types at you at the same time. In total, there are 12 enemy types. Side note, I'll be using the names from this NeoSeeker article, linked in the description, since it seems that not every enemy has an official name. Keys, triggers, sluggers, enforcers, mechs, drones, wardens, snipers, turrets, wrecks, shifts, and splitters. Keys are the simplest enemy that flash and then shoot a single shot at you. Not much to be said about these, they're a simple, nice introduction to the game and become trivial by the end of the game. Triggers are essentially keys, except they rapid fire and have to stop to reload every few seconds. It's a natural progression that builds on the skills you learn from avoiding the attacks of the keys, with greater emphasis on maintaining movement since you'll die if you stop before they reload. Could still be challenging come the end of the game, which is true as well for almost all of the remaining enemies. Sluggers are a melee enemy that will leap at you whether you're on the ground or while running. The fact that they can target you wherever you are in a level leads to some interesting interactions where you have to change your path to avoid their attacks while still avoiding the attacks of other enemies. Enforcers are triggers, except they have a shield that stuns you if you touch it, a slower rate of fire, and don't need to reload. Although they could be quite fun to maneuver around sometimes, since you have to get behind them quickly in order to attack them, their shields are slightly too big and are quite easy to hit by accident when they're first introduced, and you're still getting used to them. Mechs are, well, mechs that shoot out a wide energy blast that grows as it gets further away. Although I initially didn't like these at all as they felt awkward to play around, by the end of the game they ended up being one of my favorite enemies to fight, either baiting their attacks high before a slide or slowing down and dashing to the side. Drones are flying machines that will shoot at you similarly to keys, but you can also ride them for a short time if you jump on top of one, after which it will explode when it collides with the ground. It's frankly a little dishonest to group the drones in with enemies, as they never pose any real threat throughout the whole game. It would be more accurate to describe them as a tool that briefly expands your choice of options for movement and attack, as they allow you to cross larger gaps as well as kill enemies placed at lower elevations. They were always a lot of fun when they showed up, and my only real complaint is that I wish the game used more of them. Wardens are the next enemies, being close-range samurai that you have to parry before you can attack. And this is the first enemy in the game I have a major problem with. Wardens, when placed separately and on their own, aren't too bad, as you can usually save them to be dealt with last after clearing out the rest of the enemies. Most of the time, however, they can be found grouped together with other enemies, and since they're nearly impossible to parry while moving, whether this is a bug or it's just difficult, I'm not sure, you'll have to completely halt your movement to deal with them while either swiftly dealing with the surrounding enemies or use very quick and precise movements to dodge their attacks, and then stop moving before the warden attacks. It actively incentivizes you to engage less with the game's strongest asset, its movement. However, another enemy, the sniper, does this to a much stronger degree. Snipers are a long-range enemy that will blink a few times as a countdown when they can see you and will then instantly kill you afterwards. The biggest problem with snipers is how long it takes for the blink to refresh. When you're moving quickly around an area, you'll be quickly moving in and out of cover of the visibility for the sniper. However, if you're not out of view for roughly a full second, the countdown will not reset and you will die. This forces the player to completely halt their movement whenever the path they are running won't keep them out of view of the sniper for long enough for the countdown to reset, forcing the player to stop engaging with the game even more aggressively than the warden. Next off is turrets, which shoot out beams of light indicating their cone of vision, where if you step into it, it will instantly kill you. You would think that these would suffer from the same issues as the snipers. However, most of the time, proper thought has been given to their placement relevant to your movement, and there were only a few times they were an issue. Wrecks are ghouls that crawl on all fours and chase towards you whether you're on floors or wall running. and will explode if they touch you. Wrecks share a lot of similarities with sluggers, where they can target you wherever you are on a map. However, unlike sluggers, they never stop moving, and it leads to this great gameplay where there's a lot of them and you have to keep track of them on the minimap while you keep moving so the ones behind you don't catch up. They're also used in some parts that would usually be only platforming sections in order to make you swiftly change your direction so that you don't run straight into them, as well as lend a greater sense of tension as you have to keep moving so they don't catch up. I do have one complaint, however. When fighting wrecks in groups and they are the sole enemy, they can be difficult to deal with as you need to get close enough for them to explode and then get out of the way. This happens naturally if you're in a big room trying to take care of a bunch of other enemies at the same time, but when you have to do it purposefully, it can get tiresome very quickly. Next off, shifters are a teleporting enemy that shoots beams similarly to your surge ability and teleport away if you take too long to get to them. They're alright to fight, but I do think the time before they teleport away could be a bit longer, since sometimes they'll teleport to the other side of the map and it feels like you don't have enough time to get over before they're gone. Finally, we have splitters. Splitters are quite simply keys that divide up into 5 copies. However, only the real one can actually hurt you. You can tell the real one by using sensory boost and targeting the one not surrounded by a red line. Despite being the final enemy, splitters aren't all that challenging or interesting. When you boil them down, they're basically just keys that you have to slow down for a second before attacking. It's a pretty disappointing end to an overall rather solid enemy roster. Something you may have noticed is that there's a key aspect running through every enemy that I liked, that being that they all encourage you to engage with the game's movement, whether that be to keep moving or to do something unique, like with the mechs. Conversely, the enemies I didn't like forced you to stop moving entirely, or at least slow down. But there's technically still a few more enemies I haven't talked about, because now I have to discuss the bosses. The first and best of these awful bosses is T073M, or Tom for short. Tom consists of 3 stages where you have to target 3 different shining parts. A stage focused on dodging lasers while moving upward, a stage focused on dodging flames and upward movement, and finally, a horizontal movement while dodging flames. With as many problems as I have with this boss, I actually quite like the core idea. Instead of being an enemy like the other 2, it's more of an environmental challenge that you have to overcome. The problem with this boss instead is with the execution. We see the first example of this with the lasers, where the laser's height is only ever so slightly higher for the one you have to slide under, making it exceptionally easy to misjudge which is which. What's weird to me is that the solution seems extremely obvious. Just make one of the lasers a different color, like green or something. The sheer amount of lasers on screen is also very overwhelming in this first stage, and I feel it would have been better to introduce the idea with the stage beforehand with much fewer, and then do something more extreme. Thankfully, most of the stage can be avoided due to the placement of the grappling hook points, but when the saving grace is the fact that you can skip most of it, that's probably a bad sign. The second stage is actually quite good. You fall to the bottom of the shaft and Tom starts dripping this electric-y magma stuff onto the ground. The magma causes flames to travel up the wall that you must avoid while ascending back to the top of the shaft. It was a lot of fun to time jumps around the flames, although I do think this stage was a little over-generous with checkpoints. The climb is capped off with a repeat of the first stage, which would have been a neat way to reuse and build on part of a level, if that part was any good to begin with. The final stage is the worst out of all of them, not because it has any sloppily executed ideas like the first stage, but because it just is downright boring even in conception. After cutting a second wire, Tom falls to the ground and will continue to pulsate flames outward. However, there will also be lasers circling around it that you must slide under to avoid, while attempting to reach the 2 blue tubes laying on the floor close to it and then the one on top. This phase genuinely confuses me since you have nearly no choice in movement in how you handle it. There's no walls to run on, no slopes to slide down, no enemies to fight. All you do is walk and slide under lasers whenever they get close. I died on this stage quite a lot, not because it was super challenging, but because it was boring and tedious and I was trying to reach the tubes as quickly as possible to try and salvage some fun out of the experience. Despite this final misstep, however, Tom still remains the clear winner out of the 3 bosses in this game. It had the right idea by using the game's movement at the core of its design and creating more of a platforming challenge rather than a more traditional enemy. Unfortunately, they didn't decide to carry this over with the next boss, Hell. Truthfully, I don't have a whole lot to say about Hell, but that's not because I don't have that many complaints, but instead because that the fight is extremely simple. It's essentially a combination of a shifter and warden with an increase in health. You click in time with Hell's attacks to parry her until her stamina is drained, then she jumps to another platform and starts shooting beams at you. You then chase her down and repeat the process until her health bar reaches 0. This fight ends up being extremely tedious for a multitude of reasons. The first being the game's combat isn't really built for one-on-one drawn-out encounters. It's simple, but it's raised to greater heights via the movement. However, Hell requires you to ignore that by forcing you to stop moving in order to parry her, just like the Wardens. It's even worse here, however, since at least with the Wardens, you only have to parry them once and then they're out of the way, but with Hell, you have to do it over and over and over again. And it's not like the small amount of platforming you have to do whenever she jumps makes up for this, as it's extremely simple and short. The game tries to alleviate this simpleness and add some tension by not placing any checkpoints throughout the entire fight. However, all this does is make the boss even more tedious. Since Hell has different attack patterns for each part of her health bar, there's a pretty good chance you'll die to each one at least once and have to start the fight all over again from the beginning. The fight was tedious, boring, repetitive, and shallow. However, it still at least seemed to be somewhat aware of its issues and tried to address them by adding in some additional platforming and not offering any checkpoints. However, the same cannot be said for the game's final boss, Mara. Mara is the strangest out of all the bosses, as it feels the most disconnected from what makes Ghostrunner great, almost feeling as if it was plucked out of a different game entirely. Tom and Hell made at least some attempt to connect back towards the game's focus on movement, with Tom being a jumping challenge and having to chase after Hell after cutting her down. Mara, however, doesn't even try, and ends up feeling like a glorified game of Simon Says. Mara is separated into 3 stages in which she will use a multitude of attacks, with more being added on as you progress, in a predetermined pattern. In the first stage, Mara will attack with a sweep, which you must jump over, a burrowed claw, which will home in on you and you will have to time and dodge at the last second, and a claw drop, which acts similarly to the burrowed claw but with less tracking. At the end of the stage, Mara will attack you with a thrust attack that you must bait into hitting an electrical box on the edge of the stage so that you can hack off one of her claws. This is repeated at the end of each stage. The second stage adds on electrical floor tiles that you must avoid, as well as times when Mara will electrocute all of them, at which time the electrical panels above will not be electrified, and you must wall run on them to avoid the attack. The third stage is similar to the second, except that the electrical panels in the ground will rotate around the arena instead of staying in the same place. Something that really bothered me about this fight as I was playing was how restrictive it was in how you could address the attacks. Is it a sweep? Jump over it or die. All floor tiles being electrified? Wall run or die. It may seem like this is the case for other enemies or bosses, but let's take a look back at Tom for a brief moment to show how this is not the case. In the first stage, we will see a laser. Judging by its height, we know we have to jump over it. Seems pretty clear cut. That's the only choice we can make. Except that's not true. We could jump and wall run off the wall, we could turn around and go to a lower level, or maybe we're close enough to use a grapple point higher up. A lot of these choices come from the environment giving the player multiple ways of dealing with a seemingly simple issue. However, with Mara, her arena is very simple. It's just a small circular area. Sure, there are some panels to wall run above you, however, as I stated previously, these are only available when Mara electrocutes the floor, taking away any choice in movement. It feels so restrictive and doesn't play to the game's strengths at all, and it led to the fight feeling really disappointing after being built up for the entire game. Thankfully, there's a little bit more game left after Mara, so she can't leave a sour taste in your mouth. However, before I can talk about that, I need to talk about how Ghostrunner partitions itself into gameplay sections. The game neatly divides all non-boss levels into 3 gameplay sections: action, platforming, and cyberspace. Action segments are where you fight a group of enemies in a closed-off area where the path to continue stays closed until you kill all nearby enemies. Platforming sections are parts of the game between action segments where the only challenge is to complete the section without falling to your death, and cyberspace segments are a mix of tutorial, puzzle, and platforming bits set inside of an area known as Cyber Void. Let me start by talking about action segments, since they're where the bulk of the game is. Action segments are obviously, the most mechanically complex part of the game, as they take the parkour segments, add enemies to them, and stuff them into a relatively small area. Most of these arenas are designed to allow for a variety of approaches, but even the ones that didn't could still be quite enjoyable. Most of the problems with them spring from a handful of poor enemy designs, but I've already stated my grievances with them, so I won't repeat myself here. Parkour segments, on the other hand, have some issues. Although they can be fun at times, as you can speed through the majority of them with incredible speed, most of the time they are incredibly easy. Some take things a little further with having to hit multiple switches while moving using the Shuriken power-up, but things never get much more complicated than that. This isn't super bad or anything, these segments are still decently enjoyable. However, it is disappointing that they didn't do anything more substantial with the movement system. Finally, we have the part I want to talk about the most, and the most disappointing part of the game to me: Cyber Void. Cyber Void is complicated, not in what it is in the story or how it works or anything like that, but it's what it is and how it's used throughout the game. As each time you enter Cyber Void, it's used in one of three ways, sometimes overlapping with one another. Firstly, you have the puzzles, secondly, you have the tutorials, and finally, you have the platforming. The puzzles are more about learning how they work than applying some piece of knowledge, where as soon as you know how they work, they're very easy to solve. They're not offensively bad or anything, but they feel like pointless padding since you'll only see each puzzle once or twice and then you're done. There's also like these sections where you just kind of collect orbs and you just walk through doors and they'll teleport you to another part and you collect the orb there. It's not interesting. It's really, really boring, and this is just outright padding. This shouldn't be here. Stop it. Okay, moving on. Next off is the tutorials that show you how to use each of your energy abilities, and they do this job just fine. There's nothing really more to say about them. Finally, we have the two platforming sections, both of which fall on the opposite extremes in terms of quality. The first time you enter Cyber Void, you're required to do some extremely easy and slow platforming, even compared to what you did to reach this point, and listen to a bunch of exposition. In most games, this info would be given to a player while they're playing through a normal gameplay section or a cutscene, both of which offer their own way to ignore it, gameplay offering a distraction and being able to outright skip it in the second. The only reason that I can think of for the game to slow you down like this is because the developers thought this exposition was really important, and although it does give some important context to who's who and what's going on in the world, it wasn't interesting enough to justify the abrupt change of pace. Mirroring this, there is a final entry into cyberspace, which is a final platforming gauntlet you face after defeating Mara. This is the most challenging pure platforming in the game, since the platforms don't need to be contextualized in the world, similarly to the secret shrines in Super Mario Sunshine of all things. This is the only Cyber Void segment I liked, and I liked it quite a lot. It was exactly what I wanted them to be after playing the first one, a challenging platforming segment that didn't need to be limited by having to be contextualized within the world. It's not perfect, however, as sometimes these spring paths won't launch you far enough to clear a gap, and these red ball sections are really easy. But overall, it was a great and fitting conclusion to the game. And this was where the video was originally supposed to end. After finishing the game, I felt overall quite positive, even if there were some areas where I was let down, like some of the enemies and the bosses. However, after the credits finished rolling and I was about to exit the game, a little window popped up that said Hardcore Mode Unlocked. The thing about Hardcore Mode is that it wasn't originally part of the game. It was released in December 2020, 2 months after the game released. Knowing that, you would probably assume that the Hardcore Mode would be some really half-assed attempt to increase the game's longevity, maybe placing a few more enemies here and there and calling it a day. I'm very happy to say that that is not the case. Although you do see the expected new enemy placements, the biggest addition made is tons of new red kill barriers placed around each level, used to make existing platforming more challenging, or forcing the player to take a different route than they normally would. They've also changed the location of and added more single-use power-ups around the stage to allow greater variance in approaches. On top of this, they've seemed to realize how boring cyberspace is since it's cut out entirely except for the final one, along with removing the voices of characters you usually hear while playing through levels. However, despite all the positive things I've just noted, I do have some problems with it. Although it has almost, if not no, occasions of multiple wardens at once, which is a problem I mentioned earlier, it unfortunately still has multiple moments where it insists on slowing the player to a crawl, either through rotating turrets or placing insane amount of kill barriers. On top of this, the increased difficulty highlighted the issues with the game's movement mechanics, as I was frequently wall running on very small parts of the environment that I didn't want to. Finally, there are some slight changes to each boss fight that overall I didn't like. Starting with Tom, there were 2 turrets added to the final stage that you need to get rid of in order to hit any of the energy cells that you need to kill the boss, lengthening an already tedious stage. There were also multiple kill barriers added to every stage of the fight, and although I enjoyed the additional challenge in the first 2 stages, the ones added to the final stage just felt tedious, as all they did was make it take longer to reach everything. For Hell, they added a drone to each platform that Hell can jump to, essentially forcing you to take a specific route to the platform to get rid of them before you attack Hell. This fight's the one that's had the least change, so overall I'd say it's pretty much the same quality as the normal difficulty fight. Finally, we have Mara with the biggest changes by far, as she's had her patterns completely changed and wall running completely removed, as well as some enemies added to the area right before her arena. The gap between her attacks is also decreased in the final stage. I would have said that this was overall an improvement if it wasn't for 3 relatively small gripes I have. The first one I'm pretty sure is a bug, and it's that sometimes the burrow attack doesn't have a wind-up animation. It just goes with no warning, which can be quite annoying since it makes the time to prepare for the dodge window much smaller. The second is that the time between attacks doesn't decrease at the start of the last stage. It actually happens at the end of the second stage, almost guaranteeing that a player will be caught off guard and die at least once to it. My third and final gripe is that there's one attack where Mara electrifies 2 spots on the ground like normal, however sometimes she seems to electrify a third part as well. This doesn't seem to happen all the time, as you can see on the screen here, so I'm not really sure if this is a bug or a feature. Either way, you don't have enough time to get to the other side once you realize this is happening, so you're pretty much screwed. And that's pretty much all the major changes to hardcore mode. There was a good amount I enjoyed, like the increased difficulty and the removal of Cyber Void, along with story elements. However, it overall makes worse changes to the bosses and draws greater attention to the faults in the game's movement, as well as some questionable level design at parts. Overall, I'd say it's maybe an ever so slight improvement over normal difficulty, but at its heart, it's the same game. A great core loop surrounded by mediocrity. Looking back on this video, I've had an awful lot of negative things to say about Ghostrunner, but I think it says a lot about how enjoyable its core loop is for me to say that I still like it, and I recommend it if you enjoy challenging games. The movement might have some annoying quirks to it, and everything surrounding it is pretty average or mediocre, but when everything's working right and you just go, it truly feels amazing. I could summarize how good it feels quickly by just saying it's fast and cathartic, but I don't think that would do it proper justice. As I was writing this video, it was announced that Ghostrunner would be getting a sequel, and that makes me extraordinarily happy, because at the end of the day, we do really need more games like Ghostrunner.
Who made a choice when he was told he had none. The Ghostrunner.
Hello again, I am Chech, and thank you for watching until the end of the critique. If you're watching this video on the day it went out, I'll be streaming some Demon's Souls later on at around 7 PM Pacific Daylight Time, so feel free to hop on by. The link to my Twitch will be in the description. This video took longer to get out than I initially planned, but you know, that was the same for the last video as well, so it just seems like it's gonna be the norm. I didn't really talk about the story at all in this video, because I didn't really think it was that relevant, but I figured I'd just say my overall opinion on it at the end. The story is pretty mediocre. I thought the ending felt very disconnected from the rest of the game, and that the characters weren't all that interesting, but Yeah, but I don't think it's very important because that's not what like most people are gonna come to Ghostrunner for. They're gonna come for the gameplay, so. But I figured I'd just make a quick note of it. I'm not sure when the next video is gonna be out. I'm not gonna make any promises because that never goes well. But I don't know exactly what it's gonna be on yet because I have a bunch of videos I'm writing right now, and I don't know which one I'm gonna end up making first. More than likely, it'll end up being a shorter group review on a bunch of roguelites. But I'm not entirely sure, so no promises. Yeah. Anyways, so thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again. Bye.